Welcome everyone to the Windows Virtual Desktop Partner Learning Series. This is Module 2, How to Sell Windows Virtual Desktop. And my name is George Wood. I'm a Cloud Solutions Architect within the partner-facing team at Microsoft. We also have James Graham here with us today. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, thank you, George. Hi, everyone. My name is James Graham, so I'm a partner technical architect helping our partners create modern workplace solutions. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. So today we'll cover a few things. We'll look at some customer scenarios, and we'll also take a look at some pricing considerations. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit with, why would we be looking at sort of delivering remote applications and desktops in the first place? And there are a number of different reasons why you'd want to do that, and James has done a fantastic job at covering this in Module 1. So if you want an in-depth look at that, please go back and rewatch that. But I'll just give you a quick overview, and I think that there are a number of different reasons why delivering remote applications and desktops is definitely a good idea. A lot of it comes down to sort of governance and compliance, but also being able to deliver the right type of resource to the right type of people. So in terms of governance and compliance, that has a massive impact in terms of remote working, being able to make sure that your employees or your partners or your customers only have access to the right applications, and they do have access to them pretty much anywhere. And also the benefits of Azure, of being able to use all of the different types of virtual machines that are available, to be able to have general purpose Windows virtual machines, or some really specific virtual machines. Maybe they're GPU enabled to cater for those specialized workloads. And that's just a really brief overview of that. As I said, go back to Module 1 just to have a bit more of an in-depth view at some of the scenarios there. One thing that is very important to touch on are the licensing requirements for Windows Virtual Desktop. Microsoft 365 is one of those core requirements, but you can also leverage the WVD services with Windows 10 as well. One of the bits of licensing that I would call out here is that you are entitled to Windows Virtual Desktop even with Microsoft 365 Business, which is a sort of sub 300 user license, but can really help those small businesses get going with remote desktop services. You also get access to the FX Logics technology with the same licenses. So if you are running Windows Virtual Desktop, because you have one of these licenses, you also have the ability to run FS Logics, and I would really recommend looking to integrate with that technology. So initially we'll cover off some economic savings that are really driven by moving to Windows Virtual Desktop, and I think there are sort of 3 core areas that you can really make some savings. The first one is within the infrastructure, and there are some inherent benefits of just moving to the cloud in the first place. And so we'll look at a couple of different examples around that, a few different customer scenarios. Then there's a licensing saving that can be made. So if you're already, as a partner, as a customer going through a digital transformation, and you have a Microsoft 365 license as part of that entitlement, as part of that transformation, that's when you should really be looking to use those licenses to their utmost benefit, and maybe start to replace an existing remote desktop services management plane with the Windows Virtual Desktop management plane managed by Microsoft, and have that taken off your hands for you. And then the final point are the labor savings that can be made. At the end of the day, if you are going to be deploying an RDS farm on premises, you have to wait for all of the servers or all of the kit to arrive on premises. You have to go through all of that configuration. That's a time and a cost saving that can be made there. So probably the very first and one of the main reasons why there is a massive cost saving of moving to Windows Virtual Desktop, and that's the ability to run Windows 10 multi-session environments on Azure. And the way that compares, and if we look back to a potentially a more traditional deployment, which is even potentially when you have physical devices, if you have a Windows 10 single session on premises where each user gets their own machine, that can actually be quite expensive, especially if those users aren't actually utilizing as much of that machine as they could be. So moving to Azure and getting those users grouped basically into one machine and supporting multiple sessions per VM actually allows you to make quite a big cost saving. And on the right hand side there, you can see that we consider this to be about an 85% saving. Obviously, I think that depends what type of users you've got and what type of sort of compute you end up deploying to, but the idea of actually grouping users together in a multi-session environment in Azure on a full Windows 10 experience. Sticking with the sort of infrastructure theme, the compute and the storage is one of the things that traditionally you'd need to really plan for, and you'd need to sort of plan for the peak usage of all of that infrastructure. So a lot of the time, when all of your users are logging on, opening Outlook for the very first time, that's when all of your compute is really going to be straining, and you need to plan for that moment in time. And also, if you have any specific spikes due to an increase in remote working or anything like that, then you don't really have that flexibility. You're sort of kind of stuck at that resource. And if you did want to increase it, it's quite an investment, both in cost and in time to actually add that capability. Whereas with the likes of Windows Virtual Desktop, with all of this being hosted on Azure, you get that sort of elasticity, you get all of the benefits of the cloud that come with Azure, and that's being able to be flexible with the compute. So if you did want to provision more virtual machines, earlier in the day, and then remove those as of the connection storm dies down and the compute sort of gets spread across the virtual machines, that's absolutely something that you can do. But also, if you know that you're going to have some virtual machines turned on 24/7, because I'm sure there will be sort of those sorts of scenarios, you can also leverage things like reserved instances to really get the most sort of, I guess, cost savings out of that infrastructure as possible. And this really allows you to be agile. So before you really commit to having a reserved instance for 1 or 3 years, you can actually run the compute as a sort of pay-as-you-go instance if you wanted, for until that project is ready to go. And then once you're going to be running those servers 24/7, once they've been right-sized, that's when you can then take the time to reserve those instances and to pay for that compute. So this is sort of this next slide is something that we have just spoken about a little bit, and it is one of the a big value of moving to the cloud in the first place. So hopefully this is all a story that everyone is well aware of, but by moving to the cloud, you don't have to have that high capex cost, where anytime you wanted to reinvest in infrastructure, you actually have to buy all of that kit up front and then sweat that asset out over the course of 3 or 5 years. With Azure and with cloud, you can be much more flexible. You can turn that all into an operational expenditure and have that on a monthly basis and become much more flexible with what you need to do. And sort of going back to something I said earlier, and this is now really coming down to sort of some of the licensing benefits, and I guess we're moving away from the infrastructure, although this one kind of straddles both. We've got here that if you already do have on-premises virtualization, and potentially you have RDS CALs, or maybe you're moving to Microsoft 365, that's when you can start to look at maybe leveraging those management services that are provided by Microsoft and managed by Microsoft, and remove some of that strain from your current IT team who would be managing otherwise all of those virtualization roles, things like the gateway, the brokers, and the SQL servers that would sit within that environment as well. Moving to WVD takes that strain off of your IT teams and allows you to focus on, delivering the session hosts, delivering the scaling, delivering all of the automation, and thinking about the governance and the compliance instead of worrying about, maintaining all of that that connectivity layer. So there's a real, benefit of leveraging those different licenses, especially if you've already got them. So something that was mentioned in module 1 as well, and this is one of the benefits of moving to Windows virtual desktops. If you have any legacy applications that haven't been modernized, and I'm sure there are still some out there, if you don't want to pay for the extended security updates, which can be quite expensive, and as you can see on the left-hand side there, the cost of those extended security updates will double year on year. And effectively, if you move to Windows virtual desktops and you move that sort of Windows 7 desktop to Azure and to Windows Virtual Desktop, you'd actually be able to leverage those free extended security updates. So there are some savings to be made there. The one thing that I would say about this is you cannot run Windows 7 in a multi-session environment. That's not doable, and you should really be using this as a last resort. So some more licensing here, and the situation that you have sort of on the left-hand side is where you've got some users accessing an on-premise RDS farm. They've got RDS CALs to basically access that farm, but they've also got Microsoft 365 licenses. Perhaps they're going through a bit of a digital transformation, a bit of a modernization. That because they have the Microsoft 365 license, they do have the ability to actually move to WVD and move to a Windows 10 multi-session host. And if they move to a Windows 10 host, and they can do that through migrating to Windows Virtual Desktop, they can actually use their Microsoft 365 licenses to access those desktops instead of having to use their RDS CALs. So that can actually create a saving per user. The one thing that I would really want to point out, and that's the sort of the little star on the right-hand box, that says this saving only applies when customers migrate from Windows Server to Windows 10 multi-session. If you are migrating to Windows Server in Windows Virtual Desktop, and remember both operating systems are possible, then you definitely still need that RDS CAL. So you have to think about, what licenses you have on premises, where you're going as an organization, and whether your users would actually get a benefit from leveraging Windows 10 multi-session. So definitely some savings to be made there, and something to consider if you do have an existing RDS farm on premises and you are looking to modernize your estate. So that's sort of it in terms of the different sort of customer scenarios that we can go through. That's quite a quick overview of some of those scenarios. And when we're talking about and we're looking to sell Windows Virtual Desktop, understanding how to position it is very important, but also understanding how to price it is very important as well. And to help us price it, we've created some sort of guidelines in terms of the different types of workers that we have. And we've got a task worker, a knowledge worker, a professional worker, and a power worker. And each of these different types of users will have different requirements, going from a task worker where you're basically fitting as many users into a virtual machine as you can, all the way through to a power worker where they have a GPU enabled virtual machine and maybe doing sort of some high-end or using high-end applications for CAD design or whatever it is. We also have a storage requirement or a storage recommendation for each one of the users and their profiles. And what I would say about this guidance is a great starting point, and I would start from here, but I would absolutely do sort of some testing, run a POC, and actually understand what the right sizing is for your customers and their workloads. Every single customer is different. It will depend on the applications that they're using, but this is a good starting point. So we've got a bit of an example for 100 users, and as we can see here, I won't spend too much time on this slide. I won't labour the point too much, but we can see that the price difference from task workers all the way down to power workers. Obviously, this is affected by the compute that they're using under the scenes. The GPU-enabled virtual machines are slightly more expensive than the general purpose virtual machines, and we can get down to providing a desktop for 100 users to, as we can see here, for nearly £350 a month, and going all the way up to those more power users to about £2,000 a month. So there's a large variety there, and Windows Virtual Desktops can pretty much cater to any size organisation. This is a 100 user example. That is not the minimum. You can deploy Windows Virtual Desktop with one user if you wanted to. So a few pricing considerations here, and I will build out this slide, and then I'll sort of speak about a few of the different points here. The region is definitely something to consider in terms of pricing, but also in terms of user experience. Where you host your virtual machines, how far away from your actual users they are, will have an effect on both the pricing, because different regions have different prices for virtual machines, but also on that user experience, as those users may have to travel a bit further over the internet to effectively get access to that desktop. I would also look at things like leveraging multi-session versus having a persistent desktop. There will be some users or there will be some scenarios where everybody can be on a multi-session environment, but there might be also times where specific users actually do require a full desktop to themselves, and that's something to look at depending on the types of users that you've got. At the end of the day, remote desktops are all about that end user experience, and that will oftentimes determine the success of a project. So it's very, very important to take that into consideration, and will absolutely have an impact on pricing as well. The number of hours working in a day is also very important, because that is effectively how long each one of the virtual machines are going to be sort of allocated for. And remembering that in Azure, you only pay for the virtual machines while they're in an allocated state. Once they are deallocated, you no longer pay for those virtual machines. So there are savings to be made if you can do automation, and that actually brings us to sort of one of the next points. That is that you need to take a look at that price consideration between doing loads of automation, turning virtual machines on at 8:30 in the morning, turning them off at 6 o'clock in the evening when nobody's on those virtual machines anymore, versus having a reserved instance, which would be best applied to a virtual machine that's going to be switched on 24/7. So there are some sort of intricacies of how you want to look at that. You may end up with 1 or 2 virtual machines turned on the whole time, and I guess that will sort of also depend on your peak concurrency. So this is where you have to really understand the customer environment, how they work, to be able to really provide, I would say, an accurate price, because you could provide pricing just using reserved instances where all of the virtual machines are turned on 24/7. But again, you've got to think about the value that actually brings to your customers. And for me, reserved instances doesn't bring out the value of cloud. For me, the value of cloud is being able to be scalable, to be able to spin up virtual machines and kill them whenever you don't need them. Also, taking a look at the profile storage requirements will have quite an effect on cost, depending on how you want to do that. There are a number of different ways that you can actually set that profile storage up, whether you're using virtual machines and sort of storage spaces, or whether you're using Azure files or Azure NetApp files. Those will all have an impact on performance and also on pricing as well. And then in terms of network egress, with Azure, you only pay for traffic coming out of the platform, if we keep it simple, and that is definitely something to consider, depending on what type of applications people are using and what type of desktops people are using. If they're using more high-end desktops, that might be something else to consider in terms of network. So something else that has sort of been mentioned in the first module, which is the sort of virtual desktop assessment or estimator tool, which effectively will do a round trip between the Windows virtual desktop tenants and where you are actually located to help you understand where the best place to actually host your Windows virtual desktop tenant and where to also host the actual virtual machines and the desktops themselves. This will give you a good indication in terms of pricing, but also in terms of which region you need to deploy to, so it can actually help in terms of planning. And if you have been lucky enough to use the Azure pricing calculator, which is publicly available online, you'll be able to see that there is a Windows virtual desktop sort of section to the online calculator. You also may notice that there is a 100 user minimum from the last time I checked. Please note, and just to reinforce the point, that that is not a minimum, I guess a minimum requirement. You do not need to start off with 100 users. You can start off with just one user if you wanted to. There is also a solution configurator available. It's an Excel document that basically can help you look at a Windows virtual desktop and help you price that, and it will also go into a bit more detail than the pricing calculator would online, and that is available on request. And that is it from me for the moment. I'll also be covering module 3, but so far we've just taken a look at a couple of customer scenarios and some pricing considerations as well to take into account. And that has been me. Thank you very much for listening and for your time. Speak to you soon.